They appeared in 220 films throughout their career, including 190 short films released by Columbia Pictures in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s.
They made us laugh for decades, but behind the slaps and chaos were heartbreaks, health battles, and betrayals the audience never saw. One died too young, another fought illness in silence, and one's final moment still sparks debate till date. How did the men who defined comedy meet such tragic and unexpected ends? And what really happened when the cameras stopped rolling? Moe Howard. Moe Howard spent his entire career playing the tough guy, the loud, bossy one who smacked sense into everyone else. He was the face people thought of when they heard the Three Stooges. But the man behind it worked harder, worried more, and carried a lot more responsibility than anyone watching ever realized. When people talk about the Three Stooges, they usually talk about the comedy, the eye pokes, the slaps, and the ridiculous situations. But what kept the group alive for decades was Moe's control. He wasn't just the on-screen leader, he was also managing things behind the curtain. He handled bookings, negotiated with studios, and tried to make sure everyone got paid. The irony was that even though they were household names, the Stooges were never paid like stars. Columbia Pictures kept them under cheap short-subject contracts, paying them a fraction of what they brought in. Moe pushed back where he could, but there was only so much leverage he had. Columbia knew the act couldn't easily walk away. They were famous but not independently wealthy, and there weren't many studios looking to produce short slapstick comedies anymore. For years, the team worked tirelessly, cranking out films at a breakneck pace, while Moe quietly watched the studio make far more money than the men actually performing. But this unfair pay wasn't the only challenge. The Stooges brand of comedy wasn't taken seriously by Hollywood critics. Even during their prime, some people dismissed their work as childish or too violent. Newspapers would describe their shorts as lowbrow, ignoring the timing and physical precision that went into every routine. But Moe didn't let it bother him publicly. He knew exactly what kind of comedy they made, and he knew how much people loved it. But behind the laughs, there were plenty of personal and professional struggles. Long before the Three Stooges became a household name, Moe had already learned how harsh the entertainment business could be. His early years working with Ted Healy had been messy. Healy was a popular comedian who had the Stooges as his assistants. They helped make Healy's act a hit, but when money and credit got involved, things fell apart quickly. Healy was known for being difficult, and arguments over contracts and creative control eventually drove Moe and the others to split off and create their own version of the act. It was the right move for their careers, but the bad blood lingered. For years afterward, people gossiped about who really owned the idea of the Stooges and whether Moe and the others had been loyal. Even after the Stooges became independent, the industry didn't get any kinder. The routines were physically demanding. Constant falls, hits, and stunts took a toll. Off-screen, Moe's life was far from glamorous. And as he got older, the pace of the entertainment world changed faster than he could keep up. By the late 1950s, Columbia stopped producing short comedies entirely, and the Stooges were suddenly out of work. This was a rough blow for Moe, who had spent decades working nonstop. Thankfully, their luck turned when television stations began airing old Stooge shorts in the 1950s. A new audience, mostly children, discovered them, and suddenly the Stooges were popular all over again. Moe embraced the comeback, even if it wasn't as financially rewarding as it should have been. They made a few feature films in the 60s, and although Moe tried to adapt the act to fit the times, he was already in his 60s, and it was hard to keep up with the kind of slapstick they were known for. To make matters worse, Moe began to experience terrible health issues that would change everything. His years of heavy smoking had caught up to him, and by the early 70s, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. Although he tried to stay active by making appearances and working on his autobiography, the disease spread quicker than expected. Moe Howard died on May 4, 1975, at the age of 77. His death marked the quiet end of an era, especially because he had outlived nearly all the original members of the Stooges, watching one by one as the people he'd built the act with passed away. Larry Fine, with his frizzy hair and violin background, brought a rhythm that balanced everything Moe built, but his life after the spotlight was just as complicated. Larry Fine. Larry was the frizzy-haired middle stooge, the one caught between Moe's temper and Curly's chaos. But behind that confused grin was a man who spent his final years in a hospital room, left half-paralyzed after a stroke, watching reruns of the very films that had once made the world laugh. On screen, Larry's role was simple, at least on the surface. He was the middle stooge, the one who got pulled in two directions at once, yelled at by Moe on one side, hit by Curly on the other. His bewildered looks and high-pitched voice became part of the act's rhythm. When Moe barked and Curly babbled, Larry was the reaction, the pause that made the chaos funnier. But Larry's path to comedy wasn't easy. Long before he ever stood in front of a camera, he suffered an accident that nearly changed his life completely. As a child growing up in Philadelphia, he wandered into his father's jewelry shop, curious about the tools on the counter. He picked up a small bottle, not realizing it was filled with acid. When his father tried to stop him, the bottle spilled, and acid splashed across Larry's arm. The burns were so severe and left permanent damage to the muscles that doctors thought the best therapy was to strengthen his arm through movement. And so they suggested he learn to play the violin. This decision shaped his entire life. Larry threw himself into learning, practicing constantly until he became a skilled violinist. That same movement would later show up in his comedy. Even when he wasn't playing music on screen, there was a rhythm to the way he moved, like someone who never forgot what it felt like to perform. By the time he joined the Three Stooges, Larry had already spent years in vaudeville and had built a reputation as a dependable performer. But success didn't bring him stability. Larry had a generous nature that worked against him when it came to money. He gave freely, lent to friends, and loved to gamble, mostly on horses. During the Stooges' peak years, when their films were earning huge audiences, Larry's finances were already slipping away. Not because he wasn't paid, but because he couldn't hold on to what he earned. By the 60s, the years of careless spending had caught up to him. The group was older now, and while their films were still airing on television, they weren't earning what they once had. Larry had to sell off many of his possessions and lived more modestly than most would imagine for someone who'd been famous for decades. But these financial challenges were nothing compared to the personal losses that took a deeper toll. Larry lost his son John in a car accident in 1961, and he never fully recovered from it. Unfortunately, just a few years later, in 1967, his wife Mabel passed away too. After losing both of them, the cheerful personality that audiences loved began to fade. He continued performing, smiling, and showing up for work, but those close to him could see the sadness he carried. Larry also faced small tensions within the group too. Moe ran the act like a business, while Larry was easygoing to the point of being careless. The two clashed sometimes over money and direction, but it never escalated beyond that. Larry didn't like conflict, and even when things got heated, he tended to just shrug it off. The Stooges had been his life for so long that he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. By the late 60s, television had revived their fame once again. To take advantage of the renewed attention, they began filming a travel-themed TV project called Kook's Tour, a mix of comedy and real-life adventure that was supposed to be a modern reboot of sorts. But during production, tragedy struck. Larry suffered a massive stroke. It left the entire left side of his body paralyzed and instantly ended his performing career. Production was canceled, and Larry was forced into a long and painful recovery. After the stroke, Larry moved into the motion picture and television country house and hospital in Woodland Hills, California, a retirement and care home for entertainers. It became his permanent home for the rest of his life. Even there, he tried to keep his spirits up by cracking jokes and talking about the old days with anyone who asked, but his health never improved. The stroke had left him weak, and over time, the complications worsened. He lived out his final years, surrounded by reminders of a life spent in entertainment. On January 24, 1975, Larry Fine passed away from stroke-related complications at the age of 72. The man whose confused expressions and frizzy hair had brought laughter to millions died quietly in the same hospital where he'd spent his final years. Curly Howard. Curly Howard was the wild one, the kind of comedian who could make a room explode with laughter just by raising an eyebrow or blurting out one of his famous catchphrases. Nyuk, nyuk, nyuk. Certainly. Those sounds were pure Curly. Nobody else in comedy looked or moved like him. On camera, he was unpredictable, childlike, and full of energy. Off camera, though, his story was a lot heavier. A mix of health problems, heartbreak, and the kind of exhaustion that no one saw coming. His real name was Jerome Lester Horwitz, but everyone knew him as Curly. He was the youngest of the Howard brothers and the last one anyone expected to become famous. Curly wasn't originally supposed to be part of the act at all. His brother Shemp had been performing with Moe and Larry for years. When Shemp left to pursue his own career, Moe suggested bringing in Curly to fill the spot. At the time, Curly had a full head of hair and a mustache, and when the idea came up, Ted Healy, who was managing the group then, didn't think he looked funny enough. Curly ran out of the room, shaved his head completely bald, and came back to try again. Thankfully, it worked. The bald look stuck for the rest of his career, and it became one of the most iconic comedy images in history. From that moment on, Curly wasn't Jerome anymore. He was the lovable goofball who could make any situation twice as ridiculous just by being in it. His energy seemed endless, but behind it, Curly's health was already fragile. He struggled with his weight most of his life and had high blood pressure even in his 30s. He drank heavily, partly to deal with stress, and the non-stop filming schedule didn't help. During their peak years at Columbia Pictures, the Stooges filmed back-to-back shorts, sometimes a dozen a year. The physical comedy was brutal, and for someone like Curly, who was constantly throwing himself into walls or taking falls, it was exhausting. As time went on, the strain started to show. He began missing lines, moving slower, and forgetting cues. At first, Moe thought Curly just needed rest, but it became clear something deeper was wrong. In 1946, while filming Half-Wit's Holiday, Curly suffered a major stroke on set. Production stopped immediately, and that was the end of his career. He was only in his early 40s. The studio tried to keep the situation quiet. Fans didn't know what had happened. They just assumed he'd retired or taken a break. But the truth was, he was never the same again. The stroke left him weak, and he never fully recovered. Columbia replaced him in the act, and while the group went on, Curly's life slowly unraveled. But Curly's personal life had always been complicated. He'd been married 4 times, but most of those relationships ended badly. He could be charming, funny, and kind, but he was also insecure. Fame didn't make him happy the way people might think. When he wasn't performing, he often withdrew into himself, dealing with depression that few people around him really understood. The pressure of being Curly, the funny and silly one, made it hard for him to show when he was struggling. By the late 40s, Curly's health began to decline rapidly. He suffered several more strokes over the next few years. His speech became slurred, his mobility limited, and his once boundless energy disappeared. The man who had once bounced across the screen could barely walk. Still, Moe, ever the protective older brother, made sure Curly wasn't forgotten. He visited him constantly, bringing laughter and old memories into the care facilities where Curly spent most of his time. Fans had no idea how serious his condition was. There were no public statements, no official updates. The studio preferred to let the illusion stand that Curly had simply moved on. But the situation behind the scenes was heartbreaking. Columbia had pushed him for years to keep performing, even when he was clearly burning out. The pressure to maintain that perfect comedic energy contributed to his collapse, and it's something people close to the group talked about for years afterward. By the time he was forced to retire, he was already in poor shape, physically and mentally. Curly spent his remaining years moving between hospitals and care homes. His body weakened with every stroke, and he eventually lost the ability to speak clearly at all. On January 18, 1952, Curly Howard passed away at just 48 years old. The cause was complications from his final stroke. He had been sick for years, but his death still hit hard for the people who had worked with him. To the world, he had been the funniest stooge, but to insiders it was a tragic reminder of how much that energy had cost him. Curly's story ended too early, but his laughter didn't. And in the years that followed, his older brother Shemp would step back into the trio, trying to fill that impossible space Curly left behind. Shemp Howard. Shemp Howard was the jittery one, nervous, quick-witted, and full of strange, spontaneous reactions that made him stand out in his own way. He wasn't the loudest or most exaggerated stooge, but he might have been the most unpredictable. Born Samuel Horwitz, Shemp was actually one of the original Stooges, long before Curly ever came into the picture. Back in the 1920s, he, Moe, and Larry worked with Ted Healy in the stage act that would eventually evolve into the Three Stooges. Shemp was known for his awkward movements, his muttered one-liners, and those wide-eyed looks whenever chaos broke out. You could never quite tell what he was thinking, and that was the charm. In those early days, Shemp's comedy came from nervous energy. He'd fidget, stumble, and mumble to himself, and somehow it was hilarious. When someone threw a pie, Shemp ducked too late. When Moe barked an order, Shemp's first instinct was to panic. He was the kind of guy who looked like trouble always found him by accident. By 1932, though, Shemp had had enough of Ted Healy's temper and controlling ways. He left the group to go solo, and that's how Curly took his place. Shemp went off and built his own comedy career, working with big names and appearing in dozens of films and shorts on his own. He was doing well, but when Curly suffered that devastating stroke in 1946, everything changed. Moe needed help. The Stooges couldn't just stop. Columbia Pictures still had contracts to fulfill, and the trio couldn't function as a duo. So Moe called Shemp and asked him to come back. It wasn't an easy decision. Shemp had carved out a career separate from his brothers, and stepping in for Curly meant inheriting not just the job, but also the pressure. Curly had become a legend by then. Fans loved him deeply, and replacing him was almost unthinkable. But Shemp said yes. He rejoined the act in 1946, stepping back into a role he'd left behind more than a decade earlier. And while audiences were skeptical at first, Shemp handled it by doing what he did best: reacting. Where Curly was physical and explosive, Shemp was verbal and twitchy. He'd throw in improvised lines, odd noises, and muttered reactions that sometimes weren't even in the script. His humor came from timing and personality rather than slapstick chaos. Still, the comparisons were constant. No matter how talented he was, Shemp was often overshadowed by the legend of his younger brother. Critics called him the replacement stooge, but Moe always defended him, reminding people that Shemp was there first, and that he had helped shape the Stooges long before the Curly era even began. Behind the scenes, Shemp worked tirelessly. During his second run, Columbia kept the group on a grueling filming schedule. The physical routines were intense, and the scripts offered little creative freedom. By then, the Stooges were studio property. They didn't have much say in direction or storylines, and Shemp, who loved improvising, often found himself frustrated by the tight production style. Despite that, he still managed to make the most of it. Fans who appreciated subtle comedy began to notice his sharp timing, and they fell in love with him. The group kept churning out shorts through the late 40s and early 50s, and Shemp appeared in close to 80 films during his time with the Stooges. It was exhausting work, but he never really slowed down. Even in his 60s, he was still getting hit on the head with frying pans and falling into props like a pro. But the pace eventually caught up with him. Years of physical comedy, long filming hours, and constant travel began taking a toll on his health. Moe noticed it, but Shemp brushed it off. He loved performing too much to stop. Then, in November 1955, tragedy struck. After spending the night watching a boxing match in Los Angeles, Shemp was riding home in a taxi with a friend. According to reports, he lit a cigar, told a joke, and suddenly slumped over. He was gone instantly. The cause was reported as a massive heart attack. He was just 60 years old. His death came at a terrible time. The Stooges still had a handful of films left on their Columbia contract, and the studio wasn't about to let them go unfinished. Instead of canceling production, Columbia did something that would become one of the strangest chapters in Stooge history. They used a stand-in to replace Shemp. For months after his death, Columbia recycled old footage of Shemp, shot scenes from behind with a double, and even used editing tricks to make it look like he was still there. Fans didn't know it at first, but historians later uncovered the truth. Those shorts became known among fans as the fake Shemp episodes, a mix of real and recycled material that blurred the line between clever editing and uncomfortable exploitation. And while the Stooges would go on to continue with yet another lineup change, no one could quite replace Shemp's odd charm. Joe Besser. When Joe Besser joined the Three Stooges in 1956, the group was already a legendary name in comedy, but was also in a tough spot, especially after Shemp's death. Joe Besser stepped in to replace Shemp, bringing with him a completely different kind of humor. Unlike the others, Joe wasn't the slapstick type. His comedy was all about voice, timing, and attitude. On screen, he played the bratty, whiny stooge, the one who'd complain instead of fight back. His catchphrase, "Not so hard," became the symbol of that. Whenever Moe tried to smack him, Joe would yelp and pout like an overgrown child. It was a new kind of stooge dynamic, but still funny in its own peculiar way. Joe had a strict rule. He didn't want to be hit. It wasn't an ego thing. He just didn't believe in the kind of slapstick violence that the Stooges were famous for. Columbia had to rework the scripts to fit his limits, which meant less physical mayhem and more verbal back and forth. For a comedy team built around eye pokes and pratfalls, that was a big adjustment. Moe and Larry adapted as best they could, but audiences noticed the change. The new chemistry took some getting used to. Fans who'd grown up with Curly and Shemp didn't see Joe as a natural replacement. His humor leaned more towards sarcasm than chaos, and that softer, more passive energy made the trio feel different. Some viewers appreciated the change of pace, others didn't. Joe became the target of unfair criticism, blamed for something that really came down to timing and creative limitations. Despite the challenges, Joe gave it his best. He appeared in over 16 shorts between 1957 and 1959, bringing his own twist to the formula. His nervous mannerisms and high-pitched protests made him memorable, even if his style didn't perfectly match the physical rhythm of Moe and Larry. Off-screen, though, life was more difficult. Joe Besser, his wife Erna, became seriously ill in the late 50s, and caring for her took priority over everything. In 1958, he decided to leave the group to focus on her health. It wasn't an easy decision, but it showed how loyal and deeply devoted he was. Moe and Larry respected it, and Columbia quietly wrapped up the last of his shorts. After the Stooges, Joe didn't fade away. He moved comfortably into television and voice work, popping up on several other memorable shows. By the 1980s, Joe had retired from acting. He settled in North Hollywood, living quietly after decades in entertainment. He never seemed bitter about the criticism or comparisons. He understood that the Stooges meant different things to different generations, and he was proud to have been part of that legacy, even for a short time. On March 1st, 1988, Joe Besser passed away at the age of 80 from heart failure. He'd lived a long, steady life that stretched far beyond his brief time as a stooge, a reminder that not every chapter in the Three Stooges story was filled with chaos or conflict. Some were quieter, gentler, and still worth remembering. But after Joe's departure, the Stooges weren't done yet. The act would continue with one final addition, a new face who would carry their name into the next era: Joe DeRita. When Joe DeRita joined the Three Stooges in 1958, the group had already been through several transformations, and DeRita, whose real name was Joseph Wardle, stepped into that shifting moment with a different kind of presence that earned him the nickname Curly Joe. Unlike his predecessors, Joe didn't rely on wild slapstick or fast-paced chaos. His version of the Stooge character was softer, almost gentle, like the friendly uncle of the group rather than the zany troublemaker. His humor came from his calm expressions, dry timing, and easygoing attitude that fit well with the cleaner, family-friendly image the Stooges were building during that period. Still, his arrival came with challenges. Fans of the original lineup often said he was too tame, missing the manic energy that defined the early Stooges. The scripts were reworked to suit his gentler personality, toning down the rougher jokes and focusing on situational comedy instead. For a generation that had grown up with pies in the face and outrageous physical brawls, it was a noticeable difference. Joe didn't seem to take the criticism personally. He knew he wasn't Curly or Shemp, and he never tried to imitate them. His strength was in consistency, showing up, doing the work, and keeping the spirit of the Stooges alive through a new era. Outside of the screen, Joe's life was relatively private. He was married twice, first to Bonnie Brooks, who passed away in 1965, and later to Gene Sullivan. He never had major public controversies or dramatic family troubles. And while the other Stooges had often battled with studio politics, financial issues, or health struggles, Joe's later years seemed quieter and more stable. Even as he aged, he stayed active with the Stooges brand. He continued touring into his 60s, appearing at conventions, live shows, and television specials that celebrated the team's long history. By the late 1970s, Joe finally stepped away from the spotlight. The remaining Stooges projects had slowed down, and the era of classic slapstick comedy was fading into history. He retired from performing and settled in Los Angeles, living a peaceful private life far removed from the chaos of Hollywood. In his final years, Joe's health began to decline. He developed complications from pneumonia and passed away on July 3, 1993, at the age of 83. His death marked the quiet end of an extraordinary lineage, the last of the main Stooges to go. Who was your favorite Stooge? Drop your answers in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen like this video and subscribe to our channel for more updates.